Of Blood and Steel, written by Seymour Zainali, narrated by James Lawrence. Chapter 20. Arda, Alone. Arda shivered. She clung to the crying child. She had tried to run from the avalanche, but when the snow caught her, she muttered a spell and, using her staff, deflected the snow, which formed around her. It was dark, and the snow was compacted together. She used her staff to poke at the mounds of ice, but they were solid. Using her staff, she managed to dig herself out of the icy prison. They were alone, and Arda strapped the child close to her. She could feel the child shivering. "Balak!" She trekked through the snow, looking for any sign of Balak, but there was no reply. Only the whistle of the cold wind. Every sound made her jump, and she constantly looked over her shoulder. She tried using her magic to find him, but the shivering cold made it nearly impossible to cast a spell properly, and the child was getting cold. "I am sorry, Balak," she whispered. She filled her cooking pot with snow and headed into the forest. Daylight was fading. She checked the ground for traps and tracks. She found some mushrooms on the ground beside one of the trees. She recognized them and collected as many as she could. She filled a cloth full of berries from a bush, and her thoughts turned to Balak. She squeezed into a tiny gap between some trees and hid in the shrubbery. She was close to the edge of a steep drop, and there she set up camp using all the furs and blankets she had to stay warm. "It's all right," she told the child as she unstrapped her and laid her in her basket. Arda wrapped her tightly in the thick furs and then popped outside to gather some sticks and branches for the fire. Arda found a long stick with a pointed edge. She tucked it under her arm. The child was crying, and Arda couldn't console her. She was freezing, starving, and soaked from the snow. Arda built the fire and used some old leaves and grass as kindling. She struggled at first, as she couldn't spark a flame. She took a deep breath to calm herself and tried again. First there was smoke and eventually a flame. Arda cradled it and carefully fed the firewood. It took patience. It wasn't easy to build a fire in such frosty, damp conditions. The snow in the cooking pot had now melted into water, so she poured it into her flask. She warmed a little milk in the pot while she changed the child. Once the milk was ready, the child was content. Next, Arda squashed and heated some of the berries and fed them to her. Arda wrapped the child back up once she'd eaten, and she was soon asleep. Arda sharpened the stick with a dagger. She was crippled with hunger pains in her stomach. Her arms and legs felt weak and exhausted, but she pulled herself up and left her camp. Just a short distance away, she spotted a bird carcass with just a few pickings of meat left on it. There were small yellow maggots attacking the flesh, but Arda tied a ribbon to it and sat quietly by the tree. It was dark now, and there was a lot of scurrying from night creatures. She waited. A slow pitter-patter of steps caught her attention. A rodent slowly approached the bird. Arda moved it gently, startling the rat, but eventually it grew brave once more and approached. Arda repeated the process patiently until the animal was close enough for her to strike. She used all of her strength to drive the pointed stick and her dagger through the rat. "Ah!" Arda screamed. She held up its fresh carcass and lowered her head. It was a quick death, but she was still sad. She stumbled back to the camp. Her fire was almost out, so she spent some time rebuilding it. She added the mushrooms to the clean pot. She used her dagger to skin the rodent. She pulled back its fur from its flesh and sliced off rough cuts of meat. She chucked them into the pot and collapsed onto the furs while her meat cooked. After she'd eaten, Arda felt a little stronger, but she lay down and slept until morning broke. There was still no sign of Balak, so she decided to head for the Crimson Point. She needed to get out of the forest and to higher ground, as she had no idea where she was. She trekked through the forest cautiously. In the distance she could see smoke from a fire. "Balak?" she whispered. Arda's heart raced. She had to check it out. Arda moved slowly and peeked through the trees. 3 narts sat around the campfire, talking to each other. Arda smiled. Arda approached the narts, and they looked at her curiously. "Brek ridadara?" she said to them. The narts pointed east, but did not say anything. Arda looked to the east, but decided to go south, covering her tracks, a trick she'd learned from the bandits before they covered her eyes. It was meant to slow down any followers. She grabbed a branch with leaves off the ground and began using it as a broom to wipe away her footprints. She dropped her guard a little as she moved deeper into the forest. Arda stopped to rest. She laid the baby in her basket and sat out on a log, taking a sip of her water next to a fire. She noticed another berry bush. Its juicy berries looked delicious, so she headed over and collected some. She turned to head back to the log, and a dark figure stood by the child. Arda dropped the berries. "What do you want?" she asked in a stern voice. "Calm down," he said as he got comfortable and warmed himself up next to the fire. "I am not here to hurt you, girl." "Why do I find that hard to believe?" "We have not even been properly introduced," said the assassin. "I am Karnak. Where is your friend?" Arda screwed up her face. "My friend?" "Yes, your friend, your companion, your guide, or whatever you call him now." "He's dead." "I think we both know that's not true." "You make a lot of assumptions for a man who doesn't know me." "But I do. I've followed you long enough to know a thing or two about you, Arda. About the powers you possess, and most importantly, the child." "That's enough. You should leave, or I will make you leave." "You're beginning to sound just like him." "Thank you." "That was not a compliment." Arda pointed her spear and ran toward Karnak. He charged her. She spun and jabbed her staff into his ribs, but he was strong and struck a blow across her cheek with the back of his hand. Arda uttered a spell and fired a blue and orange flash in his direction, but Karnak jumped over it and rushed toward her, slicing her arm with his sword. Arda cried out in pain, and Karnak kicked her knee, forcing her to fall to the ground. He tried to strike down with his sword, but she caught the blow with her staff. The child began to cry, and Arda ran toward her. "Save the child and tell me where Balak is." "He is dead," Arda shrieked angrily. She rose to her feet, but Karnak struck her with his foot, sending her backward. He stepped on her throat and pressed slightly. "This is your last chance. Now tell me, where is he?" "I don't know. I looked for him. He would be here if he were alive." Karnak's eyes widened. He was livid. He pressed harder onto Arda's throat. "Liar! He's out there somewhere, looking for you." Arda grabbed the dagger from her boot and stabbed Karnak in his leg. He lifted his sword above the child, and Arda ran toward him. She dove over the child and struck his sword away with her spear. Karnak was not disarmed, and his anger turned on Arda. He sliced down over her face, and Arda screamed in pain. Karnak stood on her chest and admired the deep slit he'd put in her face. In a diagonal shape, it stretched from her eyebrow to her nostrils. Blood poured from inside her eye. "It's a shame to ruin such a beautiful face," he told her. Karnak got to his feet, and Arda writhed on the floor, holding her eye. "If you want to see the child again, Tell Balak I'll be waiting for him on the hill by the Crimson Point." "I don't even know where Balak is," she cried. "She is mine! Give her back! Come back!" Karnak scooped up the child in her basket and disappeared without saying another word or looking back.